Welcome again to everyone to our first session. The pandemic has opened our eyes to the fact that no country or no healthcare system is robust enough to face the wrath of unknown pathogens. As governments, healthcare institutions, researchers, and most importantly, the patients themselves struggle to cope with this challenge. Institutions like the World Health Organization offer the beacon of hope, bringing together all the knowledge and information into coherent and trustworthy guidelines. Now more than ever, we need an institution that can help us move forward to face the pandemic and take the lessons learned to face any future pandemics. It is my privilege and honor to invite our guest of honor and keynote speaker, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, for delivering the keynote address. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan is the Chief Scientific Officer at the World Health Organization, Geneva. She is a pediatrician by training and a clinical scientist known for her research in tuberculosis and HIV. Welcome, Dr. Swaminathan, to our 9th Global Patient Congress, and thank you for agreeing to grace us with your presence. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ratna, and greetings to all the viewers, as well as my fellow panelist, Dr. Komal from Mumbai. I think this is a difficult time for everyone, but also a good time for the Global Patients Congress to look back at the last 8 months, as well as to look ahead. I think there have been many lessons learned, many difficulties and challenges that we have gone through, but also some bright spots, some reasons and cause for optimism, I think, and perhaps a new way of looking at health in the future. So what I'd like to do maybe very briefly is to touch upon in the next few minutes, from my point of view, from where I sit as the chief scientist at the World Health Organization, this journey of the last 8 months, highlighting, I think, what I see as the positives and the negatives of this pandemic, and perhaps encouraging us all to think, jointly about a new model, perhaps, for the future. So we are now 8 months since over 8 months, in fact, since the discovery of this new virus that caused the pneumonia cases in Wuhan initially, and then, of course, even before it was formally recognized, obviously it was spreading, and this is the way we've learned much more about this virus now. So we know that quite a number of people who get infected are either asymptomatic or they have very mild symptoms and don't even think about going to the hospital or getting tested. So that's one of the factors that has helped this virus to transmit very easily. It also has a high transmissibility with an R naught of anywhere between 2 to 4, depending on the different settings, which means every infected person can infect 2 to 4 other people if precautions are not taken. And it's a small percentage of people, 15% or so, who have severe enough symptoms to seek medical care, to need hospitalization. And of that group, again, a small percentage who end up very ill in the intensive care, requiring critical care support. What we've seen is that, of course, initially when it happened, everyone was taken unprepared, from the highest income country to the lowest income country. The responses, of course, did vary from country to country, and there are some factors that help some countries cope much better and respond much better. And those factors include strong political leadership, a reliance on science and public health experts to shape the strategy, being very open and transparent with the public, having clear communication lines, and having citizens' involvement, which means people are empowered to act according to the guidance that they receive, and trust between citizens and their government. These have been some of the factors that have clearly been shown to play a major role in how well this is being contained. And over time, we've seen like different patterns emerge. There are countries which had terrible outbreaks. A lot of the European countries suffered in March and April, went into full lockdowns, and hospitals were overflowing, high mortality rate, case fatality rates in the range of 10 to 15%. A lot of the elderly, of course, suffering and dying in the process. And those countries then managed to put in place systems, but it took time. And then when they open up, many of these countries have remained at a low level of transmission. Now we are seeing a second wave in some of these European countries where the infection rates are going up tremendously. There's also much more testing. So when we look at numbers, we cannot compare what's happening today with what was there in March. The diagnostic testing capacity has expanded so much in most countries that you're able to detect many more people. The case fatality rates luckily have been falling all over the world. And that's a very good thing because I think we've learned how to manage the disease better. There are countries where the first few cases were identified, very strong action was taken. These are countries like South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, areas like Taiwan, but also some of the Scandinavian countries, Germany, where they were able to really go after the first cluster of cases. And subsequently after that also, whenever cases were discovered, go in there with massive testing. China did the same thing again, with the second and third outbreaks that they had in their food markets and so on. Test people all around that area, do strict isolation, contact tracing, quarantining, and really prevent that cluster from growing and becoming community transmission. So New Zealand, Australia, so many countries have used that approach and the cases have been quite low. Thailand, for example, very quickly contained and kept the cases extremely low. Then there are countries where it started maybe a little bit slow and then it's continued to increase. The cases have continued to grow. A large part of Latin America, North America, as well as South Asia fall into that group where there were lockdowns and so on. It flattened the curve, delayed the peak, but then the cases have continued to rise. And of course, countries like India, Bangladesh have special challenges because of the huge population and the overcrowding that these countries face. And then of course, Africa, where things started a bit slow. It's also a big challenge in diagnostic testing capacities, which has gradually built up. But still, we have not seen that degree of impact in terms of high number of cases or high hospitalizations. And that's still a question about why exactly. The demographic plays a big role. So Africa has a very young population with a median age of 22. So it's possible that infection is high, and we'll only know when we do the serological testing, but people are not really getting sick. But then again, data is very important. So countries which do not have very good data systems, surveillance systems, as well as mortality and cause of death reporting, it's hard to really find out what is happening. Whereas countries which have strong vital registration systems can easily track what's happening, especially in terms of deaths. So it's a lesson for us that these systems really need to be improved, because it's not only for emergencies or for COVID, but vital registration systems, birth and death registration, and cause of death reporting is extremely important for policymakers to make plans for their health systems. The whole shift which occurred from communicable to non-communicable diseases over the last 25 years in large parts of the world, including in the developing world, was largely missed because we don't have that kind of a tracking system. And when I was involved with the global burden of disease studies in India on disease burden, when I was at the ICMR, we were able to show over 25 years how the complete burden of disease had changed from being predominantly infectious diseases being the major causes of death to non-communicable diseases. And then even the risk factors had changed, and the major risk factors now are things like high blood pressure, dietary factors, because both over and undernutrition contribute to NCDs, and things like air pollution playing a major role in chronic respiratory diseases. And all of these, I think today we can reflect on the risk factors and the social and economic determinants of health, not just the health system. So I think there's a whole lot of work to be done on the health system. We have to improve surveillance capacity. We have to improve primary healthcare services. We need more workforce, especially at the primary healthcare level. We need community engagement and empowerment, the involvement of local communities, of patients in primary healthcare. And that is linked to the other aspect of health and well-being, which is the well-being aspect, which goes more towards prevention and promotion of health by adopting the right kind of diet and behavioral issues like alcohol, like tobacco, but also environmental issues like air pollution, water sanitation, etc., which you need communities really to engage in order to bring about a lasting change. So for us now, the strategic plan that we had for 5 years really had 3 pillars. And I think it's very relevant to what we're discussing today, because we had the first pillar, which was universal health coverage. And the goal is to have 1 billion more people under universal health coverage by 2023. And we've all seen the reports now from many sources, including the Secretary General of the UN, warning that there's a big setback now to the SDGs. So we will have a lot of catching up to do. So universal health coverage, which includes both the provision of services, essential health services, and also the financial protection mechanisms. And we've seen again during COVID, essential health services have been severely impacted. WHO did a survey in which about 100 countries participated. In the majority of countries, essential health services had been disrupted to some extent. In some countries, up to 80%, in some countries, up to 30 or 40%, starting with immunization services, antenatal and postnatal care, maternal and child health, as well as NCD services, tuberculosis, malaria, distribution of bed nets, as well as essential surgery. Of course, rehabilitation and palliative care really were impacted. So the impact on essential health services has been huge because the workforce was taken away for COVID, and that still continues to be the case. And countries need to think about how you respond to these kind of emergency situations while still being able to maintain and we have still not, I think, fully recognized the impact. And only time will tell when we look back at the data, what happened to TB. We know that case notifications went down dramatically, but what impact did it have on mortality and morbidity? What impact did the lack of antenatal services? I saw a report yesterday saying stillbirths have increased tremendously over the last 3 months. Could be linked to the lack of antenatal services. People with uncontrolled hypertension and diabetes, we know, are at higher risk for COVID. So underlying NCDs, we know, make people more susceptible to complications. And that again highlights for us the importance of non-communicable diseases. Globally, less than 10% of people who have high blood pressure have it controlled. Either they don't know they have high blood pressure or they are not taking the drugs regularly. So it's very low rates and it's one of the biggest risk factors in adults today, contributing to heart disease, cardiovascular, stroke, etc. Similarly, diabetes. So it is reminding us that all of these things, if neglected, they actually flare up during an emergency. Now, our second strategic objective or pillar in our 5-year strategic plan, I'm talking about WHO strategic plan, is around health emergencies and preparedness. And we've seen again, despite several warnings in the past from many groups, including the WHO's DG, that the world is not prepared for a epidemic or a pandemic, and that we go through cycles of panic and neglect. There's, of course, big panic when something happens like Ebola, but then once that's under control, then there is further continuing neglect and lack of investment into preparedness. So the ability to be able to detect, prevent, and respond to infectious outbreaks needs to be built in countries. This includes everything from human resource training to having, epidemiologists at the district level. Having a public health cadre and a public health service is really important. Lab capacity, data systems which get, integrated. All of these need to be paid attention to. And then our third strategic pillar really is around the healthy lives and well-being, which is where all of these other risk factors come into play. And this is where the people's involvement, community involvement, and groups like yourselves play a very important role by reminding everyone that you cannot be healthy, you can't have health for all without paying attention to the preventive aspects. And in many ways, those are difficult because either they involve behavior change, which we know is not easy, like tobacco or alcohol or physical exercise. These are all individual choices and change of behavior. But it also means a lot of policy changes need to be brought in. So one of the good things about this pandemic was that road traffic accident fatalities went down dramatically all over the world, particularly in the developing world. Countries like India, where a huge number of people die every year of road traffic accidents, it practically went down to zero. Of course, that was temporary. As traffic picks up again, this is going to increase, but it again shows the importance of road safety, the importance of mental health and suicide prevention. Again, suicide is a leading cause of death among young people. Homicide in large parts of Latin America is a leading cause of death among young people. And so these actually require multi-sectoral interventions. These interventions are not solely within the health departments or ministries of health. So policies and laws need to be made in other sectors which will impact health. So this is food, agriculture, nutrition, education, water sanitation, transport and roads. Air pollution is the environment ministry or department. So even though all of these are risk factors for health, and the health people have to be advocates for this, and they have to be the stewards for this, but actual action needs to happen in other sectors. So this is why we always talk about health in all policies or in all of government, all of society approach, which is the same thing we're talking now about for COVID. One positive, I mentioned that there have been several positives, and the road traffic accidents perhaps was one, even though it may turn out to be temporary. But the other one is really a new model of doing science and research with a lot of collaboration, a lot of openness, willingness to share data, to share knowledge, to come together, both in product development. So we've seen this for diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, but also where the public and private sector really come together. And maybe I can say a few words about the ACT Accelerator, but also in other areas where we are learning so much about this virus, the epidemiology, the transmission, the animal origin of the virus, etc. Social and behavioral research. So in February, we convened the first global research forum that really looked at all aspects of the disease and highlighted the knowledge gaps. And this was a global forum with about 400 scientists participating, researchers from all parts of the world. And we followed it up in July with a virtual forum where we had over 1,300 participants, really sharing what we've learned in the last 6 months, and where there are still big knowledge gaps, and proposing the new research priorities, many of them being interdisciplinary research priorities. So I personally, and we all believed that the solutions will come from science, and that we need to look very carefully at to leverage the scientific community globally in order to progress. So that's something we focused on, and that's something that has paid tremendous returns. It's brought a global community together, and it is also going to deliver now in terms of these new technologies that everybody's hoping for. And the fact that, mortality rates have come down over time, case fatality rates, also is partly because, or in large part, because of the sharing of information between clinicians about the best practices in patient management, as well as all the clinical trials that have been done and that have contributed to improved patient management. There's a lot of debate about transmission, and this Friday we will host a global webinar on transmission, what we've learned, what we know, and where there are still currently gaps in our knowledge. We know that it is spread through droplets, that it can be spread through fomites, and it also can be spread airborne through aerosols in certain situations, like if you're in a closed setting with poor ventilation, a lot of people crowded into the space, spending a lot of time in that closed environment. We know that you can have even super spreading events happening. So it's really important that people understand that this spreads in a variety of ways, and that interventions for prevention need to be comprehensive. You cannot control it by doing any one thing. And certainly lockdowns were an initial response because governments wanted to slow down the transmission and wanted to be prepared. But over the long term, you can't do those kind of huge, big national lockdowns again. And therefore, there needs to be a series of interventions, both from individual point of view, like maintaining physical distance, washing hands, wearing the mask, avoiding crowded settings, avoiding mass gatherings, knowing what your risks are, knowing how to protect yourself and those around you, and what governments can do in terms of providing the diagnostic and treatment services and the right information to people, and more localized data-driven approaches rather than a very widespread approach is what is needed. So the search for vaccines, of course, is huge endeavor, unprecedented efforts. We have over 200 candidates in development, 35 of them in clinical trials. We hope to have results by the first half, by the beginning of 2021, at least for a couple of the candidates, which are now in phase 3. It's a tricky business. It's not straightforward. There are ups and downs in vaccine development. Historically, success rates are between 10 and 20%. But because there are so many candidates, we hope that there will be some successful ones. The challenge is going to be scaling them up and making sure they're equitably distributed. The WHO has developed a fair allocation framework, which will be followed with a fair allocation mechanism. So we are working with Gavi on the distribution of vaccines and with CEPI on the R&D part, the promotion of research to develop more vaccines. And this is again a test of global solidarity. We will have to see how this works out. But at the moment, again, there seems to be a lot of commitment from most countries that global solidarity and equity is important, because this is an infection which does not respect borders. You cannot have pockets of the world which are protected while the rest of the world remains unprotected. That's not going to help us get back to life as normal and to, putting the global economy back on track. So that's where we are today, and the next few months will be also quite challenging because many people expect, as winter comes in the northern hemisphere, that people will go indoors, that infections will increase, and also people have maybe very high or unrealistic expectations about the vaccine. It's going to take some time for enough vaccines to be available to protect large parts of the population in all countries, so that you can then achieve a level of herd immunity, which will allow people to go about their normal business. So I think we have to be prepared. And finally, I would say that this pandemic has increased the inequities in society. It has increased the inequalities, and those who were vulnerable to begin with have been very severely impacted. And that is going to be, I think, the biggest fallout of this, that people are going to be pushed into poverty. There are people going to bed hungry, more and more hungry people around the world. And this is where our commitment to the SDGs, I think, will really be tested. Are we again able to rise to the occasion to help those who have suffered disproportionately in this pandemic. And this has again been true for all countries around the world. There are some, the most vulnerable, the poorest have suffered the most. So, so that is a rather sobering reminder to us. And I think with groups like yourselves that are advocates for the right things to be done, we should be able to come together and address this continuing challenge. But the next year or two will continue to be challenging for all of us, and we have to stay optimistic because there is light at the end of the tunnel, certainly, definitely, and we need to stay positive and help each other, you know, go through this difficult period till we reach the other end. Thank you. Over to you. Back to you, Ratna.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that thought-provoking speech and for raising so many issues that the global community has to address jointly. It's no longer about me for me and you for you, but for all of us coming together to address the challenges that all of us face. And as you said, the virus does not see borders, does not see orders, and does not spare anyone. It goes to the most richest, and it does not spare the the high-level political people or anybody who is infected by it. And also thank you for the last note, bringing hope, saying we have to stay positive and that we have to work together, because even though we do not have answers to many of the questions right now, and the virus has an effect beyond just the medical part of it in terms of the economic crisis and driving poorer people further down to poverty, also impacting global economics and the way people had learned to live and now going back to basics. We still hope that there will be a vaccine in the future and there will be other treatment options available that will help us respond better. With that, I would like to extend my warm thank you, and really grateful that you took the time out from your busy schedule to address our 9th Global Patient Congress. We now move on to our second speaker, Dr. Komal Kanitkar. While we have been discussing at length about health worker safety and patient safety, Dr. Kanitkar brings together a unique combination of a public health practitioner and a frontline COVID response team member who also survived COVID, having been infected in the line of duty. So she's a physician with a MD in community medicine, a young onset diabetes, having been diagnosed at the young age of 14 years, and a passionate patient advocate. She's also a Buchan awardee. Dr. Komal, over to you for your comments and remarks. You are muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Ratna, for this beautiful introduction. I am so glad to be sharing this space with all of you, and especially with Dr. Soumya Kavaldeep. Thank you for this. Hello, everyone. I think Dr. Ratna has done my introduction, so I can directly go on to my speech now. One thing I always say at the beginning of my speeches is that though I have been a patient before, I became a doctor only to cross that patient-doctor bridge so that I could help many people like me. And choosing public health was to understand how to understand healthcare delivery in a better way. We always talk about patient-centric healthcare, but how do you actually make it patient-centric without bringing patient voices into healthcare? In that context, Dakshima and IAPO have been extremely instrumental for me, excellent medium for me to bring out patient voices, my own voice, at platforms like these. So I'm thankful for this opportunity. When a person lives with an NCD, I am being diabetic, there are many other NCDs, non-communicable diseases. When a person lives with an NCD, it is a daily fight, it's a daily war. We are talking about war in times of COVID. So everybody says that, oh, we are a warrior, but a person with an NCD has been a warrior before the pandemic also. It is a daily struggle to even sometimes keep oneself alive. The beeper goes off, the sugars go down, you have to find your sugars, you have to feed yourself, and you have to make sure that you live, and you still have to keep on embracing it with a smile. That is what is the reality of a patient. many times at policy decision making levels, or probably from the clinical aspect of it also, this one thing of understanding health from the patient point of view is somewhere or the other missed out. It seems that we have made a compromise on the word patient centric healthcare, but what do we actually do to make that happen? Somewhere or the other, we are getting lost on that. So today, I'll be talking on that. Let's come to COVID now. COVID-19, the pandemic, we've been talking about it since the past 8 months, like Dr. Soumya spoke. In India, we also received it in Bombay. We got it in the month of March. And trust me, when this happens, there is no discrimination. I would say discrimination, or even a privilege. Okay, you have NCD or you have this or that, so it's all right. No, it's like duty calls. When duty calls, you're a doctor, you're a physician, and you've taken the Hippocratic oath, so you have to go and you have to report to duty. You have to do the needful. COVID-19 pandemic has shown us one thing, that all of us have been fighting at IAPO, at a lot of other patient bodies also. We all have been fighting for NCD rights. It has shown us how COVID-19 or any other infections also take down with them NCD patients. It is the ones who have been immunocompromised, have been battling long-standing illnesses, that have unfortunately fallen prey to the mortalities of this pandemic. A big key message today through this platform, I would like to reach out to policymakers, any policymakers who may be watching this, is that we need to protect the vulnerable. It is an infection. It is going airborne. It is going to spread. Somewhere or the other, we are finding, I mean, recent studies have shown that about 80% of Indian population has been exposed. It has been infected. What we really need to bring down is the mortality numbers. For this, I wish to bring to your notice about one term we use in disaster management. So there is a term we call as mitigation. It is a little different from disaster preparedness. Disaster mitigation means to strengthen the system enough that when the disaster strikes, we don't fall. Either there is little or no damage. Let us then apply that concept to this as well. If we strengthen our system, strengthening the healthcare system, considering the patient also a part of the system and not just somebody who is a beneficiary or is somebody who we are going to provide services to. If we consider that patient as a part of this system, then this system needs to be strengthened, and only then such pandemics or epidemics will have very less impact. I won't say such pandemics won't have any impact at all. They will have, but the number of the high number of mortalities that we are seeing today, I believe that won't be it won't be that serious. We all know about sustainable development goals that were adopted in 2015, and we all know that 3.4 suddenly started talking about NCDs. Dr. Soumya told us that when they were doing their studies at WHO, they saw that the mortalities now from communicable diseases, infectious diseases, is now very much shifted on to NCDs. 60%, more than 60% of the mortalities are attributed to non-communicable diseases. Then what? 3.4 wants us to reduce that number by 25%. It is not going to happen overnight. We really need to start investing in that. So when WHA resolution 73.1 calls for WHO to look into, to evaluate once again the coordinated response that we have had, that the international bodies have had for COVID-19, it needs to be done because the member states are all diverse. They are diverse, especially in terms of socio-cultural background and financially, economically as well. It has to be seen once again, because when we come for implementation of protocols and measures at grassroots level, the difficulties that are faced, I would say difficulties even by a community health volunteer, are way different than what we speak about even today at this Congress. What I'm speaking is nothing as compared to what community health volunteers and other grassroots level health workers are facing while implementing protocols and measures. I have lived here, I have been there, I am working with that currently, and so I think I can speak on that. One huge message, like I said, is protecting the vulnerable. And when I said protect the vulnerable population, I don't mean just physically. I mean in many other terms. We say WHO's this definition we all know, especially when even when we start doing our MBBS, or anybody who's taken a public health, they know this. health is complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just merely absence of a disease or infirmity. Now, this is a definition all doctors and public health professionals have. Like, it's right over here. If you make us wake up from our sleep, also we're gonna say it like the way I'm speaking it out. It has to be overall. It has to be holistic, and in that, one term I would like to add today is financially as well. We've been talking about catastrophic healthcare expenditures. I cannot emphasize on how many times we get calls from people that the private hospital bills are too high. Can we get into a public health facility? Can you find us a bed? This should not happen. So what I'm trying to say is the numbers are huge. The manpower is less. Probably the logistics are not sufficient enough to meet the demands that are there today with the rising number. Somewhere or the other, there has to be a strategy, that it has to be strategically made. And it is not that if at the beginning of the pandemic a strategy was made, we can leave at that. It has to be continuously revised. Me, myself being a doctor, I will tell you the truth. So I was always scared while working, even if I was on the administrative side of it, and I was working mainly on analysis and trying to bring the numbers down in my administrative ward. I can only tell you how scared I was if I contracted having diabetes for the last 17 years. Though I'm young, I'm 29, but I had no idea how this is going to affect me. Doesn't matter how good care you take, but then things you see when you do the analysis, when you see that more than 60 to 70% of the deaths are seen in people with NCDs, you don't know what your fate is, but then it is always that duty calls and you have to do what you have to do. It happened, COVID struck me. I cannot tell you how scared I was, but fortunately working in COVID, I knew how to take care of myself, but that is not going to be the case with everybody. We have lost doctors, we've lost healthcare professionals who are not even, who are less than 30 years of age and without a comorbidity also. And it is not hard and fast that just because Dr. Komal survived COVID once, she will survive it again. God forbid. But you cannot be so sure. We are seeing reinfections again. There are studies coming out. There are studies coming out from China which are saying that people who have been infected with COVID 3 months ago are now showing fibrosis. And again, there are mortalities. We don't know. Whenever a new infection strikes, we do not know how its long-term effects are going to be. I mean, who knew that somebody who's had measles, for example, has had measles in the childhood, after 15 to 20 years can have a deadly encephalitis and you don't know what this is going to do. So only thing is protect your vulnerable population. It is the aged, it is those with NCDs. And this is what IAPO, Dakshama, and so many patient bodies, NCD Alliance, even UN has been fighting, has been speaking about it, that NCDs need the attention they need. This is the need of the hour. And may I say, not just this hour, but I think for many, many hours that have been there for the past so many years. In the end, I will talk about the healthcare workforce. I am a healthcare workforce. You need
Dr.
to.
Komal,
Yes.
we have a wrap-up time.
Yes,
Please.
I'm at the end of my talk now. So in the end, I'm talking about healthcare workforce. The healthcare workforce, the healthcare workers don't have a magical immunity to COVID-19. They also get exposed and you need to protect them. Why? Because they are your best bet. We do lack manpower, but if we strategically redistribute their workforce, which fortunately some of the organizations, some of the governments are doing, but there are many of them who are not, probably because they don't know how to do it. This is my humble request, that optimum utilization of the manpower today we have in terms of healthcare workers, considering what their condition is, like mine is, it has to be done. Only then we can fight it in the long run. Because, hey, no pandemic goes away in just a few months. It is there to stay for more than a year for sure. And if we want to survive this, we want to go ahead and fight it off, we need this power with us. On behalf of all the NCD patients all over the world, I would like to become their voice today here at this platform. And I would like to request World Health Organization and the other international health bodies to reach out to their member states, considering what your member states specifically need rather than what you have to give. That's the only way that healthcare can become actually patient-centric, and the far long dream of universal health coverage that can become possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all the panelists.
Thank you.
Dr. Ratna, take over.
Thank you, Komal. And Dr. Swaminathan and Dr. Komal have raised some very interesting points that probably can make us, draw a strategic plan for the next 5 years on how to work on patient-centered healthcare and get the patient voice at the center of everything. I now refer to the WHO Resolution 73.1, which calls on action to address the pandemic in a multi-sectoral fashion. And I say that as an outcome of this Congress, IAPO has also called a call to action that will focus on the patients and patient participation in responding to the pandemic. Sorry, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next session begins now. It's about vaccine development, and I think all the questions that Dr. Swaminathan raised are going to be addressed in that. Thank you.